It is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer. Jonas, got a lot to talk about here on this episode. We are 2 days removed from Super Bowl 58. We're going to talk about some lessons that the Ravens could learn from the Chiefs' victory over the 49ers. And then we're going to look ahead to what should be an eventful offseason for the Baltimore Ravens, touch on some key offseason dates for you to mark down on your calendar, all that and much, much more. But first, let's get a quick word from our sponsors.
If you have an appetite for saving money, then you should get the Rofo Rewards app from Royal Farms. Use the Rofo Rewards app to place mobile orders for pickup or delivery and earn royalty points to redeem for free stuff. And right now, new Rofo Rewards members will get a free any-size coffee for signing up. You can download the Rofo Rewards app at the Apple App Store or Google Play today. You'll find it's a very appealing app to have. Real fresh, real fast. Royal Farms.
The CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament is February 26th through March 3rd at CFG Bank Arena. Baltimore is bringing the hoops, the culture, and the energy. So grab your tickets now and book your hotel at baltimore.org/CIAA.
All right, Jonas, before we touch on some lessons that we learned from the Super Bowl, we should obviously discuss the news that was reported by you, by Justin Fenton, and by Tim Prudente on the BaltimoreBanner.com on Thursday. And that is the news that Baltimore County Police are investigating an alleged domestic assault involving Zay Flowers. The investigation also includes a police department in Acton, Massachusetts, which acknowledged a domestic violence incident report related to an incident in Baltimore County last month and involving Flowers. Acton police declined to release the report, and Baltimore County Police acknowledged that the department had been made aware of an alleged assault in the Owings Mills area on January 21st. A spokesman said the matter was pending and the department would not release any additional details at this time. And on Friday, the department said it is, quote, working to determine if any crime has occurred. Zay Flowers has not been charged with a crime. And it was not immediately clear if he had an attorney.
Yeah, this is just not a whole lot else that we can add there. It's not like sports where we can speculate recklessly on how player X getting hurt or player Y getting signed might affect the Ravens, just because this is a serious matter and we don't know what's happening. We want due process to take its course, and the Ravens haven't commented beyond just saying that they're aware of the investigation. John Harbaugh probably won't talk for another couple of weeks at the Combine in Indianapolis. So I know it's probably a frustration with a lot of folks wondering exactly what the future of that wide receiver room is right now. But the truth is we just don't have a whole lot to add. And for us to speculate at all about what the current state of the investigation stands, where it stands right now, would be pointless and ultimately counterproductive to everyone involved. So hopefully there is a swift resolution on this, and hopefully justice is served, whichever way that is. But as of right now, we're just all kind of waiting for that next shoe to drop.
What we can tell you is we will have complete coverage on the BaltimoreBanner.com as every bit of news unfolds. And Jonas, along with Justin Fenton, Tim Prudente, reporting that initial news on the BaltimoreBanner.com. So please keep your eyes tuned to what we have coming. All right, Jonas, in other news, Lamar Jackson, it was fait accompli. We knew it was going to happen, but he won Most Valuable Player, shockingly, taking home the second award in his career, in his young career. He fell one vote shy of winning it unanimously for the second time. I think the first time he won it, it was pretty obvious that it was going to be unanimous. This time, just one vote. And it was Aaron Schatz, who was the chief analytics officer at FTN Fantasy. I'll tell you, Kyle Goon did a great piece asking Aaron Schatz exactly why he didn't vote for Lamar. I believe he had Josh Allen first and he had Lamar third. Yeah. I mean, I feel kind of bad for Aaron Schatz that he was the only one, because we talked about it when the season was happening. The 2019 season was much more dominantly Lamar Jackson's season. This one wasn't. It didn't become clear until the end of the season that it was Lamar's season. And if you were holding on to certain metrics, if you were holding on to certain narratives as the season was going along, I could see a case being made for somebody other than Lamar to get your vote.
Yeah, this was an unconventional season for Lamar because even for as pass happy as this Ravens team got, you compare it to 2019. Lamar in 2019 led the league in passing touchdowns. That was the remarkable thing about it, how someone who could, in the same breath as he breaks the NFL single season record for rushing yards by a quarterback, also throw 38 passing touchdowns, I think, that year, more than anyone else. So this was a very weird year for him in that he let a lot of the big games against the big teams do a lot of that heavy lifting for him. So I think you, Paul, if you had a vote, would have voted for Lamar for
Yeah.
MVP. I definitely would have voted for Lamar for MVP. But I think when the Pro Football Writers Association came out with their MVP, it was Lamar. But I don't think it was anywhere close to unanimous. Maybe it was 80% Lamar, 90% Lamar. But there was that room for for people to disagree and dissent. And I thought that it was kind of unfair of, some folks on Ravens Twitter to, try to hang this guy for having what I thought was a reasonable analysis of the position. Lamar, not top 5 in EPA as a quarterback, which is quite unique for an MVP to go out and do that. And if you were to have done it and won the MVP as unanimous guy without being this analytics darling, it would have been even more remarkable. I get the whole point that there are certain things that Lamar does that just can't be quantified. And I think obviously what he did to end the year with as dominant a showing as he did in those games against the 49ers, against the Dolphins, probably carried him over the finish line. But there were and pieces in games and times earlier this season where he wasn't a negative for the Ravens, but he wasn't bringing that MVP flavor to the game. So it is a full season award. It's not a December and mid-January award. But Lamar won it. He deserved it. But again, I still think it's fair for reasonable people to do the work, lay out as well-reasoned an argument as Aaron Schatz did, and say, I disagree respectfully. Here's who I would have had.
Yeah, I mean, Lamar saved his best games for the best time of the season. Like you said, those dominant wins on Christmas and against the Dolphins. And one of those just happened to being against 2 other MVP candidates. Brock Purdy had his worst game at the worst time on Christmas in front of a national audience against a guy that was going to eventually win the MVP award. And Dak Prescott had a similar kind of clunker near the end against the Dolphins. So you had, stuff to compare these two to, and Lamar left the final impression in your mind that he was the best throughout the season. And if people had voted on this award after week 11, week 12, it certainly would not have been unanimous for Lamar, and Lamar might not have even won it. He just kind of ended up putting forth his best performances against the best teams at the end of the season. Like we said, we both would have voted for him, but at the same time, we understand why Aaron Schatz didn't vote for him. And he also becomes, Lamar does, the youngest QB to win 2 NFL MVPs and the second youngest player behind Jim Brown. Just a ridiculous amount of accolades that he has. We talk about Patrick Mahomes winning as many Super Bowls as he has at age 28. Lamar has a lot to do to get to that level, but to rack up as many accolades as he has. And for, all the talk at this time last year, how Lamar completely changed the narrative, how he completely recaptured the spotlight in this season. It's a season that deservedly got a lot of attention.
Yeah, unfortunately for Lamar, this isn't like a Chuck E. Cheese situation where if you win a couple of MVPs, you can just trade them in for the bigger prize, which is the Super Bowl. So
does that happen at Chuck E. Cheese?
You just get the tickets. Remember, you
right.
get the tickets from the games, and then you
just trade them in. Yeah,
for the big.
I thought it was going to be like a pizza thing. You know how they got caught taking pieces of pizza from old pies that were left over and then hodgepodging them together and turning it into a pizza.
I don't know. I haven't been to Chuck E. Cheese since I was 23.
You're missing out. Let me tell you, my friend. Charles Entertainment Cheese.
But with Lamar, you don't want to say there's like a conflation of excellence because Lamar was excellent, just as the Ravens defense was excellent. But to have a generational level defense being your backup in a season like this, means a lot. Just looking at the stats before he hopped on, no team in the NFL started with average field position better than the Ravens. And, the margins aren't tremendous when you compare like the first ranked team to the 32nd ranked team. But over the course of the season, those differences manifest themselves. You get in better position for field goals, you get in better positions for touchdowns, you get, turnovers like we saw in that first Browns game where the Ravens are starting in Browns territory and don't have very far to actually get into the end zone and, have Lamar author another MVP type play with some of the stuff that he was able to do. So if Lamar wins next year with what we think will be a lesser defense backing him up, then, all the credit to him, because he'll probably still have a top 10 defense, just like he did in 2019, just like he did this past year. But it's going to be really, really tough to deny his excellence if the Ravens find themselves at the exact same spot at the end of the 2024 regular season as they did at the 2023 regular season.
Well, speaking of the defense, promotion, Chris Hewitt promoted. Ian Rappaport reporting that the Ravens passing game coordinator / secondary coach, Chris Hewitt, will add assistant head coach to his title. That's a title that Anthony Weaver had before he left to take the Dolphins job. So some promotions already happening under Zach Orr's defensive staff. All right, Jonas, let's touch on some lessons that we learned from the Super Bowl. Was a tight, exciting game that you and I watched exclusively on Nickelodeon. What a terrific broadcast they did. The only flaw in what was really a phenomenally entertaining broadcast was that I did not know, as the game was coming down the wire at the end of OT, that not only did each team have a chance to possess the ball in overtime, but each team had a chance to finish their drive in overtime. So I was thoroughly confused as to why Andy Reid was not calling one of his two timeouts as they were coming down the wire and they had 1st and goal, and he ended up just running it in with a quick pass to win the game. I thought it was that the game was going to be over and they were going to lose or have to kick the field goal if he dropped that pass.
We were also thoroughly confused why Jesus was trending on Twitter, and then it turns out that there was a weird foot ad. So
yeah,
I guess go to church, everyone. Jesus loves your feet.
Let's let that be, Jonas. What were some of the lessons you wrote on the BaltimoreBanner.com where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months? Which, by the way, I broke down. That's an insane. That's what, pennies a day that you get $1 for 6 months? No, less than that, right? Because 6 months is what's half of 365. I'll come back to you.
2.5.
Yeah, so it's less than a penny a day that you can get Jonas's stuff. That's pretty ridiculous. Jonas, you wrote about some lessons that you learned from the Super Bowl. What was top of mind after watching that game?
We've talked about this, how unfair Patrick Mahomes makes comparisons for everyone in the NFL, and I think none more so than for Lamar Jackson, playoff Lamar. I guess we should specify, because when you compare like the turnover-worthy play rate from PFF, which isn't counting just the bad throws that end up as takeaways or the bad dropbacks that end up as strip sacks, but also the plays that perhaps should have, when you throw a pass to a defender and they just drop it, or you hang out in the pocket for too long and you fumble the ball away, but one of your big offensive linemen hops on the ball and keeps possession. So if you compare like the regular season turnover-worthy play rate of Patrick Mahomes to the regular season turnover-worthy play rate of Lamar, it's remarkably similar. It's like in between that 2 to 3% rate. And then you look at the playoffs, and it is just two wildly different people, two wildly different stars. Like until Patrick Mahomes threw that interception in the third quarter, I think it was against the 49ers, he didn't have a single turnover-worthy play this entire postseason. Meanwhile, you compare that to Lamar and what he did in that game against the Chiefs. He had 3 or 4, including 2 that actually ended as turnovers. So it's something that Lamar is going to have to fix. It's something that the Ravens are going to have to reckon with, as we think go into the playoffs again next year as a top team in the AFC, because the margins get so thin against these top teams, and the Ravens defense more often than not has delivered the goods for Lamar. They've been able to win games with relatively low scoring outputs because the defense more often than not has come to play. But when the running game gets out of whack, or players drop passes you just can't have a quarterback who's touching the ball almost every single play put the ball in harm's way. And we've seen that happen too often over the years. Even going back to 2019, there was the interception, there was the fumble that led to the easy Titans touchdowns. And it sometimes all, a game comes down to is just those 3 or 4 plays that swing the balance. And Lamar's got to find a way, and this Ravens offense staff and the playmakers around him and the offensive line protecting them have to find a way to keep the ball out of harm's way, because if Mahomes has one more turnover in that game, we're probably talking about the 49ers as Super Bowl champions right now.
I will say, as a counterpoint to this, that the Chiefs did have 5 fumbles in that game. I know they only lost one of those fumbles, but they were putting the ball on the turf quite a lot. That fumble also was inside the 49ers red zone. There were kind of trade-off fumbles early in that game where Christian McCaffrey had the fumble inside the Chiefs 20-yard line, and then the Chiefs turn it right back over. So those kind of balance themselves out. But I think it's interesting that you bring up the turnover question in this, because like you said, Patrick Mahomes did have that interception in this and they still won the game. So I do think you can overcome those issues, and it's easier said than done. There is a certain amount of turnover luck that is involved, in any of these games. And it's something that I don't know exactly how you fix. If you try to go too conservative and try to limit the number of interceptions that Lamar has, then you may end up with a situation where he's not aggressive enough downfield. The strip sack fumble that he had in the Chiefs game, he was looking to be aggressive and to throw a deep ball to Rashad Bateman. And maybe if he had one extra second. So maybe if that's an offensive line issue, turnovers, I feel like, are just, 1, a luck factor, and 2, the byproduct of so many different factors. It's like you said, it's offensive line, it's, aggressiveness, it is pure just ability to hold on to the football. Some players have it, some don't. So there are a lot of things that go into that. It's hard to pinpoint any one issue when you say, why is Lamar fumbling? Why is he turning the ball over more in the playoffs than he is in the regular season?
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that I would like to ask Lamar and just give him a shot at truth serum. I mean, even kind of thinking back to game day on AFC Championship game, like, he came to the stadium, it seemed like way earlier than he normally does, which is kind of weird for a guy who's so accustomed to his routine. I don't know if I'm misremembering, but it seemed to me like he came to the stadium like 3.5 hours before the game, when usually he's rolling up 2.5 hours. And just with how slow the Ravens offense started that game, and how slow they started so many of these playoff games with Lamar, you just wonder if he goes out of his way to change things up, puts himself in a position where he doesn't feel entirely comfortable with the routine. Obviously, the Ravens played at a different kind of time in the day because of TV considerations and everything like that. But you just want your quarterback feeling as comfortable as possible, even though the stakes and the hype and the atmosphere we're in that game are going to be unlike anything that you face in the regular season. So, it's tough for Lamar. He put on Instagram a couple of days after, just like the kind of some meme about a guy crying, and obviously, he seemed in much better spirits at the NFL honors. But he takes these, for any Ravens fans who were listening, I'm sure he takes these setbacks, as hard or even harder than you guys do. But at a certain point, you gotta have that breakthrough, or as he'll tell you himself, all these MVPs and hardware that he's gonna be able to put up on his mantle just won't really matter a whole lot in the broad sweep of NFL history.
Maybe he was just trying to avoid the Taylor traffic that was coming from the airport. True. He could have just been looking to do that. Another lesson that you wrote down on the BaltimoreBanner.com that you learned from the Super Bowl: needing an alpha on pass rush. The Ravens did have that. They did have Justin Madubuike, and he did come from the interior, which is similar to the Chiefs having Chris Jones. The Niners have Nick Bosa, who's an edge rusher. But it seems like all of these teams, whether it's the ones who win the Super Bowl or the ones who get to the Super Bowl and lose, they all have at least one dude on the line who can consistently rush the passer.
Yeah, and even though Madubuike was the man this year in terms of total number of sacks, I mean, you could argue that in terms of generating pressure, Clowney was even more impressive. He was like top 5, top 10 in pass rush win rate on ESPN. Kyle Van Noy had a bunch of sacks. Adafe Owe for a stretch there in the middle of the season was maybe more impressive than either of those guys. And it's possible that it's Matabike and Owe who take the lead next year, and that gives you kind of a reproduction of what the Ravens had this year. But you just look at what these teams have had who've been able to get to the playoffs. The Eagles last year, they had a big four that made them just a terror to deal with. That team led the NFL in sacks, just like this year's Ravens team led the NFL in sacks. The Bengals a couple years ago, Trey Hendrickson, I think over 15 sacks. Even the teams that haven't had a truly dominant guy, they've had guys step up. That Tom Brady Buccaneers team that won the Super Bowl. I think JPP had 9 or 10 sacks in the regular season. Falls off a little bit in the postseason, but then you have Shaq Barrett, taking over and just dominating against that overmatched Chiefs offensive line. So you either better have a defensive coordinator who knows how to scheme up those pressures, just like Steve Spagnuolo was able to, or you better have just a guy who at times can be unblockable, and maybe that's just Matabike. We don't know if just how close he is to his ceiling as a player. I think it's probably a lot higher than what he showed this year, which is a scary thought for the Ravens and for offensive linemen everywhere. But there's no guarantee that he's going to get anywhere close to 13 sacks next year, just because it could be a lot of situations where the Ravens aren't getting as many third and longs, or teams aren't enforced into as many obvious passing situations. So you better have as many good pass rushers up front as possible so that you can affect the Joe Burrows and the Patrick Mahomes and the Justin Herberts of the world. It's just as simple as that.
I mean, Matabike may not be hitting his ceiling, but also, do you worry about Matabike's floor being lower than some of the other teams' top pass rushers? Because prior to this season, he did have just 8.5 sacks in 3 seasons. He's not a former first round pick. He's a former third round pick. I know he's still young, but maybe there is a little bit of a thought that this season was perhaps a bit of an anomaly, and you take him out of Mike McDonald's defense and he's not nearly as productive. I know you said, just sack number wise, it's almost no doubt that he's going to not reach 13 sacks, but also not just be as productive getting to the quarterback, because his floor might be a little bit lower than somebody like, TJ Watt or Aaron Donald or Chris Jones.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that he plays 16, 17 games again next year and only ends up with 5 or 6 sacks. I mean, Aaron Donald had, I think was number 1 in like pressure rate, number 1 in win rate, depending on where you look, number 1 or number 2 at players at that position. And he finished with 6 sacks, 7 sacks. I mean, it's a lot harder as a interior tackle, as an interior defensive lineman, I think, to be able to get those huge sack numbers, just because you can have 3 guys with eyes on you at all times, depending on how you're aligned. I mean, the great thing about Chris Jones is that the Chiefs can line him up as that 5-tech edge rusher and have him bully right tackles, left tackles, wherever they see fit, and be able to kind of scheme up pressures in such a way where he is getting a one-on-one. Whereas if you're Matabike and it's only a 4-man rush, then you're probably going to have that guard that you're up against and the center, paying attention to you as well. And it's really, really tough unless you're Aaron Donald or Chris Jones to beat those double teams consistently. So I think, as with the defense, like we've talked about, it's probably fair to expect a statistical regression next year for Matabike. But if it's a situation where he's just saving his best for the playoffs, or Zach Orr is saving some exotic play calls for him, or Adafe Owe or Tavius Robinson or whoever develops into that secondary pass rusher next year, that's all they need. Chris Jones, I think if you remember, like a couple years ago, was not being able to get home. It was either him or Frank Clark, tremendous regular season production, just wasn't able to step up in the playoffs. And he stepped up now for 2 Super Bowls in a row, where he's been the guy to swing a game with, single-handedly with just a couple single pressures.
Yeah. And one other thing I will say, you need a dude on the defensive line, like an alpha. I think you need a dude in the passing game, a pass catcher, because we talked about ad nauseum this year. The Ravens did not have a single receiver, tight end, pass catcher that went over 1,000 yards. Mark Andrews has been the safety valve, and him not being at 100% and him essentially barely playing in that AFC Championship game against the Chiefs dramatically hurt the Ravens, but he's still not a tight end of the level of Travis Kelce. Nobody is. I think Travis Kelce's pretty clearly the best tight end in football, but both those teams, had pretty reliable safety valves, pretty reliable outlets to go to. I know Deebo Samuel didn't have a particularly good game, but I think the Ravens still do need an alpha in the passing game. Whether it's Mark Andrews putting together 1,000-yard season this year and becoming, in launching himself back into the elite tight end category, or whether it's they go out and get a wide receiver. But I think you need an alpha in the passing game as well.
Yeah, and that maybe feeds into discussion about like where the Ravens go next year offensively, because another consideration / takeaway / lesson is you don't need to follow like the NFL meta of 11 personnel is the only personnel that works. The Ravens, if they don't sign Nelson Aguilar, if they don't sign, or retain OBJ next year, then the top two, if Zay Flowers is back on the team next year, is Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, not in that order, obviously. And then it's a big old question mark at wide receiver 3. And I imagine they'll take someone in the draft. Maybe you can hit on, Rashid Rice in round 2 or round 3. But, the 49ers, the Chiefs, the Lions all show that you can be successful and make defenses uncomfortable by playing in these formations with a second tight end or with a fullback. And, to have that balance and to be able to force these, these guys at the front of defenses to always be worried about whether a run's coming or a pass is coming or a toss is coming or whatever is coming, and to be able to threaten on early downs in so many different ways, I think is important. And, the Ravens were more effective this year in 12 personnel than they were in 11 personnel. Now, obviously, it is a smaller sample size of 12 personnel than it is 11 personnel, but still, you do wonder with Todd Monken having his background at Georgia, a guy who had Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington and just used those guys to beat up and stretch defenses so effectively. I don't think there's a great analog for Darnell Washington, a big body blocking guy, but we've seen these teams with not great tight ends be able to line up, not great blocking tight ends, just to say, be able to line up with multiple big boys along the line of scrimmage and still be effective run blockers and effective pass catchers. And you wonder, depending on how things shake out with this wide receiver construction this offseason, maybe whether we see the Ravens go back a little bit more to the Greg Roman style of 12 personnel, 21 personnel being the preferred mode of offensive conduct as opposed to the 11 personnel stuff that we saw this year.
Again, I think you've triggered some Ravens fans just by mentioning Greg Roman's name and the possibility that they could go back to that. You have to actually run the ball, though, more than the Ravens did in the AFC Championship game. John Harbaugh got plenty of questions of it after the season. Look, the Chiefs in the Super Bowl were down 7 or 10 for the majority of the game, and they continued to run the ball. They weren't afraid to, they didn't scare themselves into just throwing the ball every time Patrick Mahomes dropped back. 18 carries for Pacheco for 59 yards. I know that's a not a great average, but you at least have to present the threat that you're going to run the ball. And what the Ravens did in that AFC Championship game was they became one-dimensional. They stopped running the ball, and they made themselves much easier to defend. Even though, yes, they were going against some heavy boxes, they at least had to show that Gus Edwards could take the ball once every 3 or 4 times that the Ravens were running a play. Where the Ravens could get a lot of their production, though, from, you mentioned, the Chiefs hitting on some of those later round picks, like Rashid Rice being a second round pick and turning into a number 1 wide receiver for them. Ravens are going to have to maximize the draft, as every team does in football, but most importantly, the teams that are paying quarterbacks these mega deals, like the Chiefs are for Patrick Mahomes, like the Eagles are for Jalen Hurts, like the Bengals are going to be for Joe Burrow. You have to hit on not just your first round picks, but your second, third, and fourth round picks with a higher frequency, especially because you're going to be drafting later in each of those rounds. And the Chiefs did that very well. We saw Trent McDuffie, great defensive back, George Karlaftis, good edge rusher. Uh, Lots of guys who they got in the mid to late rounds coming up big for them and doing so on a very, very cheap price tag.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably and Buffalo Bills fans, if you're listening, earmuffs, like the big difference between how these past couple of years have gone for the Bills as opposed to the Chiefs is the Bills haven't been able to land anyone or land like the number of people that you need to in the draft to be able to put themselves over the hump when they actually go against the Chiefs. Like if you're taking a first round pick and spending on someone like Kyer Elam, who was a first round cornerback out of Florida, and then just having him be not very good, then that is a huge waste of draft capital. Meanwhile, the Chiefs, even though they haven't been all hits, like, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was supposed to be the running back who would take their offense to an even higher level, and he's been a total bust, but it hasn't mattered because you know what? They found Isaiah Pacheco in the 7th round, just like the Ravens were able to, get the surplus value of having Gus Edwards be an undrafted guy. So the Ravens will not have the same draft capital this year that the Chiefs did in 2022. That was, I think they entered that draft with 12 picks total because of the Tyreek Hill trade to the Dolphins, but they ended up with 10. They ended up with so many worthwhile guys. Creed Humphrey is a Pro Bowl level player. Trent McDuffie, obviously, as you said, all pro. Karlaftis, 17 and a half sacks these past 2 years. So, the old adage from the Daniel Jeremiah, the former Ravens scout, who's now, a great draft analyst for the NFL Network, is that a good draft is finding 3 starters in your draft class. And that's going to be tough for the Ravens, like it is for any team, but they should have 8 picks. They should be able to find guys who you would think would be able to fit in pretty seamlessly, especially if you're taking an offensive player. Like if you're taking a wide receiver with that 1st or 2nd round pick, that's probably good enough considering the state of this depth chart to be able to slot in and make it work. I think it helps having like a guy like Todd Monken, who used to coach wide receivers, be the offensive coordinator, because he can hopefully make things a little bit more receiver friendly for you. But the Ravens are in an era now where Lamar's cap hit is going up significantly every single year, and that means that there's less flexibility for Eric DeCosta. There's more pressure on him. Him meaning Eric DeCosta and Lamar as well. And you can't come away from these drafts, especially when you have as many picks as the Ravens should have this year, with like just one contributor. It was obviously a little bit different situation for the Ravens this past year because they didn't need Trenton Simpson to be anything more than a special teamer. They didn't need Tavius Robinson to be anything more than a rotational guy. But the hope is that those guys, along with Zay Flowers, will develop into starter level players, just like the Ravens will need a couple starters from this year's team to keep things cost effective and team friendly.
Well, you wonder if the Ravens need players who can contribute earlier in their rookie contracts, because Justin Madubuike was, like we said, 8.5 sacks in his first 3 years, 13 sacks in his contract year. The Ravens have taken some guys who are going to quote unquote redshirt. David Ajabo wasn't a complete redshirt his first year, but barely played in his rookie year, gets hurt in his 2nd year, and you're not going to know anything about him really until his 3rd or 4th year. Odafe Owe was seen more as a project when he was taken. And I know because you're drafting later, it's not like you're going to be near the top of the draft and you can take somebody, who is going to be a day one contributor like the teams that are, in the top 10. But you wonder if the Ravens need to focus a little bit more on guys who can contribute early in their contracts so that they're not waiting. Kyle Hamilton, rough start in his first however many games, turns it on in the back half of his rookie season and is phenomenal and all pro in his 2nd season. Guys like that don't need a couple years to get going, that can contribute right away so that they are doing so very cheaply. So you're not getting to the 4th year and saying, well, crap, he just had a career year and now he's due for free agency. I don't know how exactly you do that. And maybe it means taking a fewer risks in the draft and trying to hit more doubles instead of home runs. But that's certainly a strategy that has helped the Chiefs.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting if the Ravens find themselves in a spot on day 2, and let's say that they made the decision to keep both Ronnie Stanley and Morgan Moses, and there's like a nice developmental prospect there that they really like, that's high on their board. Do you take him as a draft and stash player,
Right.
or if there's a running back, or if there's a edge rusher that you really like who's there, who is maybe a little bit lower on the board, but the positional need for it and the ability for him to come in and crack that Super Bowl window a little bit more, where do you go? Because Eric DaCosta has always talked about wanting to not over index on certain years. You want to be able to keep that competitive window open as long as possible. But does that mean that in this case, with Lamar's cap hit escalating every single year, do you forego that long-term thinking
Right.
in some respects? Do you take the quick, easy, high of getting a guy this year, even if you know that maybe down the over the course of his career, he doesn't have a ceiling as more than an above average player, when you could get a good or potentially great player? So these are going to be the decisions that the Ravens have to make. I mean, I think the fun thing about the draft is that there's really no one who knows more than anyone else. It's just a matter of like, which are do you hit on the quarterback, and how many lottery tickets do you give for yourself? Because the Ravens have done a good job of buying a lot of lottery tickets, and that gives them a better chance at winning. And you have other teams who spend it all and don't end up with a whole lot, or you have teams that spend a lot and are still able to overcome it, because the 49ers miss on Trey Lance but find Brock Purdy, and now they're sitting pretty for this past year and next year as well. So it's going to be really exciting to see what they do and how they approach this year's draft, because they could go a lot of different directions, from trading up to trading down to selling late round picks in this year's draft for next year's draft because they don't like the depth of this 2024 class. So yeah, I mean, we're gonna talk about it a lot, but there's a lot of different interesting angles to how this thing could unfold.
That's a perfect transition to talk about some key off-season dates that we have coming up. Now that the Super Bowl is over, we are fully into the off-season. And Jonas, next up on the calendar is the franchise tag deadline, which is March 5th at 4 p.m. Eastern. The window opens this Tuesday, or I should say a week from today, February 20th. That's the next big one. Obviously, whether the Ravens use that franchise tag on Justin Madubuike is going to be the biggest question there. Then you've got the scouting combine in Indianapolis. We're going to have Gianna Hahn there. That's February 27th to March 4th. The negotiating period for free agents is March 11th at noon. I think that's a Monday. That's when teams can start talking to unrestricted free agents from other teams and essentially legally tampering. And then March 13th at 4 p.m., that's a Wednesday, I believe. That is when the new league year begins, which means unrestricted free agents can sign with any team. Then you've got a big gap. You've got a month and a half, essentially, before draft night on April 25th in Detroit, Michigan. That's the first night of the NFL draft. And then finally, May 2nd is the deadline for teams to decide whether to exercise or not exercise the fifth-year options of guys that were drafted 4 years ago. So that would be Rashad Bateman and Odafe Owe for the Baltimore Ravens that they have to make a decision on. So a lot coming here in the offseason, Jonas, and we're going to keep you apprised of all information as we go here on the Banner Ravens podcast.
Stay tuned. And yeah, I'm trying to think of something witty. Oh yeah, we forgot to mention the big lesson is that the Ravens should have done everything they could to have Patrick Queen date Dua Lipa as was his wish. It's now 100% hit rate for teams with global pop icons winning Super Bowls. So I think the Ravens should do everything in their power to put out feelers toward. I don't know. I'm so out of touch. Like who's someone?
Lana Del Rey was in
for the Ravens.
Lana Del Rey was in the box.
She's not a global pop icon.
What? Lana Del Rey's a superstar.
Maybe like 5 years ago.
Don't we have an update on OBJ's relationship status with one of the Kardashians?
Yeah. I guess they're looking to take things up a bit.
Sure.
But I'm looking for a pop icon, a popular singer. And this is where I expose myself as it's washed because I can't think of anyone else who's even close to on the Taylor Swift level
Well,
who
nobody
might
is.
be
Yeah,
single. Because obviously
nobody's even
Beyonce
close.
is married to Jay-Z.
Yeah, I mean, Dua Lipa's up there. Like he said, that's a good comparison.
Maybe someone could like reach out to Olivia Rodrigo.
Yeah.
She's on the come up.
I know not a singer, but Sydney Sweeney her star is on the rise. You know, lot of options out there
Yeah.
for you and I, Jonas. All right, that just about does it for the Banner Ravens podcast here. Follow Jonas at Jonas_Shaffer on Twitter. I'm at Paul Mancano and at All Banner Sports. Thanks so much for tuning in. And please like, review, rate, subscribe. If you give us a good review on Apple Podcasts, we'll read it out here on the podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and